Hello and welcome to Close Reading Classic Literature with me, Dr. Octavia Cox. Today I'm going to provide an analysis of Percy Bysshe Shelley's wonderful, thought-provoking poem To a Skylark, which was written and published in 1820. And To a Skylark is often thought of as being a profound contribution to Romanticism. So if you're interested in Romanticism and understanding more about Romanticism, then unpicking Shelley's To a Skylark is a really good place to start. In particular, I want to focus on the ironies within the poem, something that's not often looked at, I think, in analysis of the poem. I want to look at the ironies because I think they highlight the inherent incongruence of Shelley's argument, Shelley's position within the poem. Almost as if Shelley's point, holding up the figure of the skylark, the figure of the bird, the blithe spirit, as something to aspire to, was doomed to failure from the outset, and that really is one of the tragedies of the human condition, that we can revere the skylark, but that we can never actually be like the skylark. To consider these ironies, I'm going to look at 4 points. I'm going to start off by looking at the opening metaphor and the subsequent similes that happen within the rest of the poem to chart the poet's position in relation to the bird. I'm then going to look at the questioning mode of the poem. I'm then going to look at an allusion to Shakespeare, and then I'm going to close by looking at the narrative voice's focus on the listening world. Remember, if you like this video, then do please give it a big thumbs up, and if you like what I do here on my channel where I analyse classic literature, then do please subscribe. Shelley's poem To a Skylark is often held up as a poem that espouses ideas that are central to Romanticism. So we have a reverence for nature, a representation of the solitary figure, a consideration of the individual mind, the role of the poet, a comparison between nature and humanity, and even the figure of the bird, or the symbolism of the bird, and the poet's relationship to the bird are central to many celebrated Romantic period poems. We might think of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Nightingale, for example, which was published in Lyrical Ballads in 1798. We might think of William Wordsworth's To the Cuckoo, published in Poems from 1807. And of course, perhaps one of the most famous Romantic poems, John Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, which was first published in July 1819 and then published again in his Poems volume of 1820. And Shelley's To a Skylark joins in that poetical conversation. Shelley even states expressly in the preface to his 1820 volume of poems, in which To a Skylark was published, he says, "One word is due in candour to the degree in which the study of contemporary writings may have tinged my composition. It is impossible that anyone who inhabits the same age with such writers as those who stand in the foremost ranks of our own can conscientiously assure himself that his language and tone of thought may not have been modified by the study of the productions of these extraordinary intellects." So what he's saying there is that he is expressly joining in the conversation with those other extraordinary intellects, and he can't help but have his mind be modified because he's living in the Romantic period, because he's engaging with these poetical conversations and philosophical discussions with all these writers who are living around him. So if you're interested in Romanticism and the ways that these poets sort of communicate with each other within their poems, then To a Skylark is a really interesting one because it has so many allusions to, for example, To the Cuckoo. So as I've said, if you're interested in Romanticism, then this poem To a Skylark is a really good one to unpick and interrogate, as I will do today. So let's start then with the analysis. I'm going to start with stanzas 1 to 6. There are 21 stanzas in the poem, and I've broken them down into what I think are the sort of different movements within the poem. Mary Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley's wife and the author of Frankenstein, later recalled the evening that was the inspiration for the poem. It happened during an evening walk listening to the singing of real skylarks. She writes, "It was on a beautiful summer evening while wandering among the lanes whose myrtle hedges were the bowers of the fireflies that we heard the carolling of the skylark, which inspired one of the most beautiful of his poems." That's an editorial note to her edition of Shelley's poetical works from 1839. The poem then was apparently inspired by real life events, that is, actually hearing a skylark singing, a real bird. And it's worth noting, I think, given that the figure of the skylark within the poem, it seems to take on this almost mythical symbolism. It scorns the ground in the closing lines of the poem. So you've got this event happening in the material world, the real world, that inspires a painting of the skylark in these mythical terms. And I think that's really important when we come to unpick a bit further the meaning of the overall poem. The poem opens expressing this difference, that is the difference between a real bird, a real skylark, and the symbolism of the skylark as a mythical spirit figure. Hail to thee, blithe spirit. Blithe meaning carefree. Hail to thee, blithe, carefree spirit. Bird, thou never wert. And this is how William Wordsworth's To the Cuckoo begins. You can see immediately that there are some comparisons that can be made with the opening of Shelley's To a Skylark. So Wordsworth's poem begins, O blithe newcomer, I have heard, I hear thee and rejoice. O cuckoo, shall I call thee bird or but a wandering voice? So you can see some of the same themes emerging directly in those two poems. So the poem opens with a metaphor. The skylark is a blithe spirit. And spirit here means sort of essence or soul or dominant emotion or feeling. And bird here means sort of real life creature, real life animal. And the poet says, bird, thou never wert. So this skylark has always been more than just a mere animal. It is a spirit. It is a mythical figure that sort of floats above the real material world. So we start with this metaphor, and then the rest of To a Skylark is a poem sort of filled with similes. It's a procession of like, saying the bird is like this, it's like that, it's like the other, or is it like this, or is it like that, or is it like the other? Shelley, or the poet, continually tries to find a good comparison for the skylark. And in these opening 6 stanzas, these comparisons are sort of celestial. So it's like a cloud, it's like a star, it's like the moon. As the poem progresses, these comparisons become more and more earthbound, more and more attached to the world. And the opening line, hail to thee, blithe spirit, is itself, as we will come to see as we look at the rest of the poem, deeply ironic. And you only realise that it's deeply ironic when you have read the whole poem and you come back to the opening line again later, because hail to thee. Hail is an expression or a sort of outpouring, fulsome praise, an exaltation, an outburst of praise. Hail to thee, blithe spirit. This is the moment in the poem when the poet is closest to being that blithe spirit, closest to embodying that same carefree spirit. In this exclamation, hail to thee, blithe spirit, that is the poet pouring out their heart, their full heart. And we'll get to that a little bit later in stanza 1. That's the moment where the poet is most closely in the moment, as we might say now, most closely just feeling, when it exhorts hail to thee, blithe spirit. As the poem progresses, and as the poet tries more and more to define the skylark, the further and further away the poet gets from embodying that same blithe spirit, that same carefree spirit. And that really is the fundamental irony of the poem, although you don't realise it when you come across this opening line the first time. So I'm now going to read through these opening 6 stanzas and unpick them in a little bit more detail. Hail to thee, blithe spirit, bird thou never wert, that from heaven or near it pourest thy full heart in profuse strains of unpremeditated art. Starts by articulating what the bird is figuratively, what it is symbolically. Bird you never wert. It's denying its material presence. It's denying the animal nature, the body of the bird. And it's celebrating its pouring out of its heart unpremeditated. So it's unconscious, it's unthoughtful, it's just pouring out its heart. It's an unpremeditated art. And there are two things to point out here. The first is that really unpremeditated art is almost a contradiction in terms, because art has to have some kind of meditation about it. It has to have some kind of thought about it, or at least it does in the world. It does to humanity, because art comes from artifice. So art is inherently, there is something inherently artful about it. By its very nature, there is artifice to art always. So there's almost a contradiction in terms that the idea of having an unpremeditated art. If it's unpremeditated, then it's not art. So we've got that irony and that sort of contradiction on the one hand, but we've also got the bringing back of this to the figure of the poet. So for the bird, they can have an unpremeditated art, or at least an unpremeditated expression of their heart, but poetry is not an unpremeditated art. I mean, particularly poetry, because poetry requires so much construction. You've got rhythm, you've got rhyme, you've got to fit the words in a good order. It's a very constructed art form, actually. Even if it gives the appearance of being natural, it is in fact very meditated. So from this very opening stanza then, we ought to be made aware that the bird is fundamentally different from the poet. Poetry is not an unpremeditated art, and it can't be an unpremeditated art. So the poet fundamentally really cannot be like the skylark. And then the poem continues. Higher still and higher from the earth thou springest like a cloud of fire. So there we have like a cloud, like a celestial being. The blue deep thou wingest, and singing still dost soar, and soaring ever singest. So the bird gets higher and higher and higher and higher. It's kind of moving away from the material world. But still it sings, still it pours out its heart. In the golden lightning of the sunken sun, over which clouds are brightening, thou dost float and run like an unbodied joy, whose race is just begun. And I love that phrase, like an unbodied joy. The bird, the spirit, the skylark, is unbodied. It's taken out of the material world. It doesn't have a body. It doesn't have a kind of physical material presence. It is only essence. It is only spirit. And calling it an unbodied joy really serves to highlight that the poet, that those of us who live in the real world, that those of us who sort of exist in the actual world are bodied. We do have to sort of exist in the material. We cannot just keep floating out and out and out of the world to become this kind of ethereal spirit. In some sense, you could say that we are entrapped by the material world because we are trapped in our bodies. We can't escape in the way that the bird can. And that's why the bird is such a good symbol for romantics, because it seems to actually escape from the world because it couldn't fly away. In a way, obviously, that humans can't. The pale purple even melts around thy flight like a star of heaven, like a star, celestial, like a star of heaven in the broad daylight. Thou art unseen, but yet I hear thy shrill delight. So it's flown up so high that it can't be seen anymore. This adds to the idea of it being unbodied. It just sounds like a voice coming from the heavens. Keen as... Another simile, keen as are the arrows of that silver sphere. The silver sphere might be the moon, it might be Venus, it's not necessarily clear, but whose intense lamp narrows in the white dawn clear until we hardly see. We feel that it is there. So again, we've got a difference between the material world, the physical world of the senses, and the feeling world of the spirit. So we can hardly see. That's obviously a sense. You see things in the material world, but the bird gives us a sense of feeling its presence rather than seeing its presence. So it's sort of outside of the material world. And the fact that we feel rather than see the bird adds to this sense of it being a kind of mythical presence rather than a real life bird. All the earth and air with thy voices loud, as when night is bare from one lonely cloud, as moon rains out her beams, and heaven is overflowed. So the feeling that this bird gives is like heaven overflowing. So I'm now going to move on to look at stanzas 7 to stanzas 12. The poem opens trying to articulate a comparison between the blithe spirit, the bird, and the celestial similes. And then in stanza 7, so we're about a third of the way through the poem, Shelley directly asks the bird a question. So we're beginning to enter into the kind of questioning mode of the poem. What thou art, we, humanity, so the earthbound rather than celestial, know not. What is most like thee? And proceeds to make these earthbound comparisons. And I think, again, it's worth pointing out that we are moving further and further away from the opening metaphor, where the poet says, "Hail to thee, blithe spirit," and that's just an outpouring that the poet can say in the moment. Even in asking that question, what is most like thee? You're moving away from the certainty of that metaphor, and you're saying when something is most like something, it is still only an approximation of it. It isn't actually it. Trying to define something or trying to say what something is by saying, is it like this or is it like that or is it like the other, or it's most like this or it's most like that or it's most like the other, it's already acknowledging that there is to some extent some kind of gap, some kind of difference, as there is between a metaphor and a simile. Even just by trying to articulate what the blithe spirit is, by putting all these comparisons forward, the poet is already falling short of blithe spirit of the bird itself, because it is questioning, because it's interrogating. What thou art, we know not. What is most like thee? From rainbow clouds there flow not drops so bright to see, as from thy presence showers a rain of melody. And there's a confusion of senses here. So we've got drops so bright to see, so the material world, seeing, senses, and hearing, as from thy presence showers a rain of melody, hearing. So there's a confusion of sensory experience. And now we're moving into the various different similes that start these stanzas in this section. And the first one is important. Like a poet hidden in the light of thought, singing hymns unbidden till the world is wrought to sympathy with hopes and fears it heeded not. So we've got explicitly the poem, the poet, the figure of the poet being brought into the poem. And as soon as the poet is brought in, thought is brought in. Like a poet hidden in the light of thought. So there's already an acknowledgement that the poet is associated with thought. So in the first stanza we had the blithe spirit and its unpremeditated art. Here the poet is introduced, and the first thing that's mentioned in relation to the poet is thought. So again, explicitly, the blithe spirit and the unpremeditated art are set in contrast with the poet and thought. Even if the poet thinks it's singing hymns unbidden without effort, we've still had that idea of thought being introduced. Unbidden means sort of without conscious effort. Till the world is wrought to sympathy with hopes and fears it heeded not. Again, we've got a contrast to the bird figure because the poet cares about the world. So as soon as the poet is introduced, we've got thought and then we've got the world. So the poet thinks about the world. Till the world is wrought to sympathy with hopes and fears it heeded not. Hopes and fears. The bird figure gets further and further away from the world. As we learn in stanza 2, it flies higher and higher and higher. But the poet, the first thing is that it thinks about what the world should do in response to the poet's hymns. There's also a care in the poet that the world heeded what the poet said. Till the world is wrought to sympathy with hopes and fears it heeded not. It should have listened to what I said. And I'll get back to this when I talk about stanza 21, the very final stanza in the poem, but we can think of this perhaps as being like Shelley himself, saying, the world should have listened to me, but it hasn't. And again, that's a completely different way of thinking about pouring out your heart than the blithe spirit has. The bird isn't aware of the listening world. It isn't aware if the listening world is heeding it or not. It is just pouring out its heart. As soon as the poet comes into the poem, that all completely really goes by the wayside. All those aspirations for being carefree, being blithe, because the poet cares about the world and what the world thinks of what the poet is saying. So here's another simile then. Like a high-born maiden in a palace tower, soothing her love-laden soul in secret hour with music sweet as love, which overflows her bower. So she's singing. So we've had the poet, we've had a beautiful woman singing, and then we have like a glowworm, golden in a dell of dew, scattering unbeholden its aerial hue among the flowers and grass which screen it from the view. So is that what it's like? Is it like a glowworm who emits this light, even if that light isn't seen? Like a rose embowered in its own green leaves, by warm winds deflowered, till the scent it gives makes faint with too much sweet these heavy-winged thieves. Heavy-winged thieves are bees. So the bees go from all these different flowers to different flowers to different flowers to different flowers, kind of scattering or provoking the smell of these roses. Is that what it's like? Sound of vernal showers, spring showers, on the twinkling grass, rain-awakened flowers, all that ever was joyous and clear and fresh, thy music doth surpass. Even laying out all these similes, trying to define what the bird is, trying to find what the bird is like, and still the poet says, but you're nothing like any of these, you surpass all of these anyway. So all of these earthbound descriptions, the bird surpasses. So even trying to find that definition hasn't worked. I think it's also worth seeing that in this section, the different similes are to do with the human senses. So the poet, or things that we would associate with humans, with humanity. So the poet brings in the idea of thought, the maiden, the fairest human, singing or music, so that's hearing. The glowworm, sight. We've got the view of the glowworm. The rose, we've got scent, so we've got smell. And then rain, the rain, the spring rain showers, we've got sound, and also twinkling grass, so the sight of the twinkling grass. But the essence, the spirit of the skylark surpasses all those human senses. I'm now going to move on to stanzas 13 to 17, and this is about the poem where the narrative voice really begins to step up the questioning mode, almost as if it's interrogating the bird. And this is a fundamental problem for the poet. The bird does not analyse itself in the way that the poet does. And the paradox, of course, is that if the bird did analyse itself as the poet does, then it would, indeed it could, no longer be a blithe spirit. As the questioning mode gets more and more urgent and more intense, the speaker, the narrative voice, gets further and further away from embodying or being like the spirit of the skylark. So this section opens, teach us. The poet is asking the bird, teach us, teach humanity. And again, we've got a fundamental contradiction here. The bird cannot teach what it is unconscious of. The bird is simply pouring out its full heart. We, as humans, we might learn from the bird, or we might take lessons from the bird, but the bird cannot actively teach us. Otherwise, it would become conscious of itself, become conscious of what it was doing. And then it would lose the very thing that set it apart, the very thing that makes it a blithe spirit. Teach us, sprite or bird, what sweet thoughts are thine. I have never heard praise of love or wine that panted forth a flood of rapture so divine. And again, we're going back to these kind of celestial images. Chorus hymeneal. Hymen is the Greek god of marriage. During a marriage service, when human voices come together and it's related to to an important kind of religious ceremony and triumphal chant. During this time of religious symbolism even are our voices, is our choral music as high as the singing of the bird. Matched with thine would be all but an empty vaunt, so an empty boast. So no, it doesn't match up. A thing wherein we feel there is some hidden want. This is the stanza where the questioning mode really begins to come in. What objects are the fountains of thy happy strain? What fields or waves or mountains? What shapes of sky or plain? What love of thine own kind? What ignorance of pain? And you can see that it gets more intense in the way that it's laid out. So the first question is over 2 lines. The second question is over 1 line. The third question is over 1 line, but it's a shorter line than the second line. And then the fourth and the fifth question there are 2 questions in 1 line. So the poet is getting kind of more and more frantic trying to ask the bird these questions. And of course, the very fact that there is this questioning mode is exactly what the bird does not do. The bird does not question. But the poet is getting more and more frantic, questioning. The final question, what ignorance of pain? The very question itself exposes the difference between humans and the skylark. Anyone who understands the question must know what pain is, and therefore cannot be ignorant of pain. So only those who understand what pain is will even understand the question. If you don't know what pain is, you won't know what it is to be ignorant of it. But if the bird can sing in this carefree way because it has never experienced any pain, then it won't even understand that question. Fundamentally, it could not possibly understand that question. And because in a way this is an illogical question to ask, because the bird could not answer it, even if it was ignorant of pain, it wouldn't understand the question. So it could never, there is no logical way in which the skylark could answer the question. It shows how far away the poet is becoming. This questioning voice is moving from the symbolism of the blithe spirit. With thy clear keen joyance languor cannot be. Languor, sort of a sleepiness. Shadow of annoyance never came near thee. Thou lovest, but never know love's sad satiety. So satiety, that's when you've had enough. Again, the blithe spirit has never had the shadow of annoyance, apparently, and yet really the poet is exposing his or her annoyance at not being able to define what the skylark is satisfactorily to itself. Waking or asleep, and dreams are also a really important feature of Romanticism, and you can see a similar point being worked through in John Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, where he also has this idea of, was it a vision or a waking dream? Dreams are a sort of space where you are in some sense unbodied, because your spirit is sort of released from the shackles of being awake and has these flights of imagination or flights of creativity or flights of something which seem otherworldly. So waking or asleep, thou of death must deem things more true and deep than we mortals dream, or how could thy notes flow in such a crystal stream? So now I'm moving on to look at stanzas 18 to 20. We look before and after, humanity. We look before and after, and pine for what is not. Our sincerest laughter, it's a beautiful oxymoron there, our sincerest laughter with some pain is fraught. And this is really a kind of central paradox, one of the central tragedies of humanity. Our sweetest songs are those that tell of saddest thoughts. A crucial point to note here as well is that for humans, thought and song, so poetry, are entwined. Our sweetest song tells our saddest thoughts. So again, we're just not like the spirit of the bird, because the best poetry we have tells our saddest thoughts. Yet if we could scorn hate and pride and fear, if we were things born not to shed a tear, I know not how thy joy we should ever come near. I know not how thy joy we ever should come near. Again, we're still, the poet is still questioning if then. And this is sort of looking before and after and pining for what is not. So the poet can acknowledge that pining for what is not makes us unlike the bird, and yet the poet continues to do it by saying, but if we could do that, if we could do the other, then would we be more like you. So the very fact of saying if we did this and if we did that makes us not like the bird, because we are pining for what is not, and the bird is not pining for what is not. Better than all measures are a poetical rhythm. So better than all measures of delightful sound, better than all treasures than in books are found, thy skill to poet were, thou scorner of the ground. And here we've got another irony within the poem, which is that Shelley is making an allusion in this section to William Shakespeare's Hamlet. Hamlet as a figure is symbolic of pontificating over action, symbolic, you might say, of overthinking. So in the play Hamlet, the character Hamlet worries that humans were created with such large discourse looking before and after. Shelley alludes to that in the line, we look before and after. So we think about the past, we think about what's gone before, and the future, what will come after. We look before and after. We cannot just live in the moment. This is the text from Hamlet, and this is from Act 4, Scene 4. What is a man if his chief good and market of his time be but to sleep and feed, a beast no more? Sure, he that made us with such large discourse, looking before and after, gave us not that capability and godlike reason to fust in us unused. So fust, to rot or to mould. So Hamlet's point here is that humans have this godlike reason, this godlike capability to think large discourse, and that puts us closer to God and less like the beasts, because we have reason and we should use it because God has given it to us. If we don't use it, it will rot, it will decay, it will fust, and God didn't give it to us so that it would fust, so that it would rot away. So Hamlet really sees man as above beast in this section, and in alluding to this section of Hamlet in his own poem To a Skylark, Shelley is drawing on this idea in some sense to suggest a reversal. So Hamlet thinks that beasts are lesser than man because we have godlike reason, and Shelley in the poem is considering the other idea, so that perhaps being a beast, so being an animal, being a bird, is preferable because they don't have godlike reason. They don't overthink everything. They can exist without worrying about what comes before and after. They are just in the moment. They just are. They just exist. They don't worry. And this is ironic, and we can see that when we get to stanza 20, because the poet acknowledges that the skylark is better than all treasures that in books are found. But in referencing Shakespeare, the poet is doing that very thing. The poet is drawing on a treasure found in a book. So the poet says how much better the bird is, and yet draws on a poet's skill, Shakespeare, to articulate this point. The treasure of the bird is better than a treasure in any book, and yet the poet draws on a treasure from another book, from Shakespeare, in order to make the point, sort of undermining its own argument. Moving on then to the very final stanza, stanza 21. The poem is not quite as disembodied or mystical or unbodied as I think we sometimes think it is when we first come to it, or as it might first appear. And Percy Bysshe Shelley wants the world to pay attention to his poetry, as I've already mentioned, just as he is compelled to listen to the bird. So the final stanza reads, teach me. So in the previous section I was talking about, it says, teach us, humanity. And now the poet says, teach me. It's back to the individual. Teach me half the gladness that thy brain must know. Such harmonious madness, poetry, from my lips would flow. The world should listen then, as I am listening now. And this goes back to stanza 8, where the poet is first introduced. Like a poet hidden in the light of thought, singing hymns unbidden till the world is wrought to sympathy with hopes and fears it heeded not. We're back to the idea of the poet and the world and being heeded and being listened to. The irony, of course, is that the bird does not care if it is being listened to. The poet does care if he or she is being listened to. The bird does not care if it is being listened to or not. It does not care about the listening world. It's not even aware of the listening world, which is in complete contrast to the poet, who keeps, whenever the figure of the poet is introduced, keeps bringing up the world and the fact that it wants to be listened to and it wants to be heeded. The poet does care and is aware that the world is listening or not listening. In the preface that I've already mentioned to the volume of poems that To a Skylark was published in, Percy Bysshe Shelley concluded with specific reference to his critics, so to the listening world, and the injury that they had given to him in their criticisms of his poetry. He says, "The having spoken of myself with unaffected freedom will need little apology with the candid, and let the uncandid consider that they injure me less than their own hearts and minds by misrepresentation. Whatever talents a person may possess to amuse and instruct others, be they ever so inconsiderable, he is yet bound to exert them. If his attempt be ineffectual, let the punishment of the unaccomplished purpose have been sufficient. Let none trouble themselves to heap the dust of oblivion upon his efforts. The pile they raise will betray his grave, which might otherwise have been unknown." Although Percy Bysshe Shelley professes that his critics injure themselves more than they injure him, their criticisms clearly rankled. Shelley felt poetic oblivion staring him in the face. This may perhaps seem odd to us now, given that Percy Bysshe Shelley is held in such high esteem. I mean, is even regarded by many as being the best poet in all of English literature. So I think it's hard for us to think of him as thinking of himself as being unlistened to. But at the time, he was virtually unknown to the reading public at large, and his poetry was deemed by the critics to be obscure, to be even nightmarish. Even his friends, so Leigh Hunt, for example, who was who first published Percy Bysshe Shelley's poetry in his journal, The Examiner, so a big supporter of Shelley and a big advocate for Shelley and helped Shelley on his poetic career. But even Leigh Hunt considered Percy Bysshe Shelley's poetry to be too abstract. And I think it's worth remembering the preface when you come to think about To a Skylark, because although on the one hand it seems to advocate for the blithe spirit of the skylark as being ideal, at the same time the poet itself undermines the possibility of ever achieving that ideal. And actually what the poem reveals, in contrast, is that the figure of the poet within the poem, which we might take to be Shelley himself, does care about being heeded by the listening world, wants to be listened to by the listening world. That's the very final line of the poem, of course. "The world should listen then, as I am listening now." The poet closes by crying that the world should listen to him as he listens to the bird. And this really is a final irony, because the poet cares about and is aware of the listening world. "From my lips would flow, the world should listen." Essentially, the poet is saying, the world should listen to me. The world should listen to me. Now, he might be listening with reverence to the bird, but the bird is not aware that he is listening with reverence. The poet wants to inspire that same relationship. So just as he is now listening to this blithe spirit above and is in a sort of position of reverence to the blithe spirit above, he wants his critics, those listening to him, to be in the same position where they see him with reverence kind of above them. But just by acknowledging that he wants to be listened to by the world, he has already undermined that comparison. From my lips the world should listen. The narrative voice fundamentally is not a blithe spirit, and so cannot be as the skylark is. The bird is not aware of the listening world, but the poet within to a skylark desires to be heeded and listened to. And this is our sincerest laughter. Our sweetest songs are those that tell of saddest thought. And to a skylark articulates one of humanity's greatest, saddest thoughts, which is that we cannot experience and communicate the joyousness of the skylark because we are conscious beings. We are aware of ourselves. We meditate, we think, in contrast to the unpremeditated bird. We care about the world around us, and so can never be wholly blithe spirits. Thank you very much indeed for listening. I do hope you've enjoyed exploring this wonderful poem of Percy Bysshe Shelley's. Remember, if you like what I do here on my channel, then do please subscribe, give the video a big thumbs up, and do leave any comments that you have below about Shelley, about this poem, about your interpretation of the poem, about your response to my interpretation of the poem. I'd really love to hear from you.